When I worked as a pizza delivery driver for a few different places, I encountered many peculiar customers and incidents. This one night stands out as the most unsettling and out of the ordinary of all time. For a little under a year, I had been employed by that particular pizza chain. Typically, my coworker and I split our time between midday and night shifts. Even though there were only the two of us, the bar would remain busy until closing time at 2 in the morning. To protect his anonymity, I'll be calling my coworker Tom. Tom was a few years older than me, and he was a steady worker who kept to himself. During the overnight shifts, he was in charge of making the pizzas, and I was in charge of delivering them. However, we would take turns answering calls based on our availability. Well, it was after 11 p.m., and I had just returned from making a delivery when the phone rang. I looked over and saw Tom in the midst of making pizzas, so I decided to answer the call. The other party on the line spoke up and requested a large sausage pizza. I placed the order and inquired as to whether he required anything else. After he didn't hear anything for a while, the man repeated that he wanted a big sausage pizza. This time, his slurred speech made it clear that he was under the influence of alcohol. The man said yes when I asked if I was sure he only wanted one pizza. I hit send on the order and grabbed next delivery to get it off to its destination. Tom had already packed up the customer's order and was ready to deliver it by the time I returned to the shop, so I grabbed it off the counter and dashed to my car. Tom gave me a strange look like he wanted to say something to me but didn't, and I noticed this as I reached for the order. However, Tom was typically quiet and reserved, so this wasn't too out of the ordinary. Although the address was 15 minutes away, I was able to arrive early because there was almost no traffic. The house was typical, but it was surrounded by a lot of land on both sides, so you could hardly make out your neighbors' houses among the foliage. I exited the vehicle, walked around to the passenger's side to retrieve the pizza, and then went up to the porch and rapped on the door. A man walked in and flung open the door a few seconds later. This wasn't so out of the ordinary, but I've never understood why anyone would open their door that far. However, he looked very perplexed and surprised to see me, as if I had caught him off guard. I gave him the box and told him the bill, figuring he was just drunk and confused. He handed me the money awkwardly and didn't say a word. He was standing in front of me, pizza box in hand, and staring at it with an odd intensity. He then looked up at me, but not directly in the eyes. Instead, he looked over my shoulder as if he had spotted something, staring at it with the same intensity before slowly shaking his head as if to say no. I felt so uneasy watching this man that I had to turn around. I turned my head over my right shoulder and looked toward the driveway. A hooded man was just feet away from my car, retreating into the trees. My body went into a state of shock as my heart sped up, and I found myself at a loss for what to do. When I turned back to face the man at the door, he backed up and slammed the door. I had no time to respond because everything happened so quickly. When the door shut behind me, I whirled around to face the masked man once more, but he had vanished into the shadows of the trees. After stumbling down from the porch, I made a beeline for my car and sped back to the office. The drive helped me relax, but I still couldn't make sense of what had transpired. I told Tom about it when I got back, and he didn't seem too bothered, instead telling me to bring the next order whenever I was ready. I did as he asked, but on the way home from making the delivery, I pulled over and contacted the authorities to let them know. They assured me an officer would investigate and get back to me with any new information as soon as possible. An hour later, I received a call, and upon leaving work, I waited in the parking lot for the police to arrive. The police officer who approached my car said he had spoken with the man at the house who matched the description I gave him, and that the man had said he was waiting for his friend Tom to show up because he knew Tom worked at the pizza shop. He refused to elaborate on the hooded man, saying he had no prior knowledge of the incident and had not seen anyone wearing a mask. This new knowledge only increased my shock and perplexity. I was worried that they had called Tom because they mistook him for a delivery driver and were setting him up for an ambush. That explains the mystery of the hooded man by my car and the shock of the man at the door. Tom's look at me makes me wonder if he's trying to tell me something. I asked Tom about it several times, but all he ever said was that the man was an old friend of his and that he didn't know anything about the situation. I quickly found a new pizza place after that, but now that the shock has worn off and I realize it probably wasn't a target on me, I'm enjoying trying to solve the mystery. What happened was the strangest and creepiest experience of my life, and I still don't know what it was. I was driving for DoorDash and Uber Eats on Sunday evenings to earn some extra cash. A chum of mine taught me how to use both simultaneously to increase my hourly rate of pay. One of the most frustrating aspects of working as a delivery driver is the long periods spent between orders. But if you use both apps simultaneously, you can eliminate that downtime and make money nonstop. I had been doing this for a few hours when I received a small order from a restaurant in the area, but the house was quite a way away. Even though this order offered a lot of money, it's still the worst kind because you have to drive a long way and get paid less, so the tip must have been enormous. After agreeing, I grabbed the order and drove the 25 minutes to their location. Tom's about halfway there when the app called, presumably from the customer. In response, I confirmed if this was indeed my Uber Eats client. A man identified himself as one of my customers and profusely apologized, explaining that he had placed an order using a friend's account and neglected to update the shipping address. But then he gave me directions, telling me which turns to make once I got to my friend's house, saying that he was just around the block. I asked for the address in case I got lost on the way, but instead, he told me to wait outside and he'd come to get me. This man was not typical, but I was already well on my way, so I decided to give the guy the benefit of the doubt, reasoning that it was entirely possible to forget to switch it from your friend's address. Although I wasn't afraid of anything, it's possible that the fact that I was a bigger guy helped me decide to make the delivery anyway. Following the man's directions to his friend's house, I found myself driving down a dark residential street until I came to a no outlet sign and realized the road dead-ended a few houses down. I was confident that I had followed the man's directions for turning, so I pulled over and called the customer. I just finished reviewing my most recent calls when someone rapped on my driver's side window. When I looked up at the man, I was a little taken aback by how visibly startled I looked, so I quickly rolled down the window to greet him. However, the man's face was completely expressionless. As soon as I released the window button and pressed the lock button, the man thrust the gun through the partially opened window and aimed it at my head, shouting something. When they called again, I could hear more voices, and then I saw a bunch of people rush up to the car and start fumbling with the door handles. In the heat of the moment, I couldn't make out the specific instructions they were shouting at each other. I was in complete disbelief as I stared down the barrel of his gun. There were probably around 5 or 6 people hanging around my car. When the man with the gun glanced away for an instant, I slammed on the gas and took off down the street at full speed. I don't even remember thinking at the time. It was more of a reflex. The man managed to get his hand out of the window with his gun still in it, and I'm surprised he didn't drop it. When I reached the end of the road, I made a quick U-turn, and when I turned around to look at the beginning of the street again, nobody was there. There wasn't a single one on the streets, sidewalks, or yards. They must have left the scene as soon as I started the car. When I finally left the area, I dialed 911. These attacks by groups are common in this area, but I never imagined that I would be a target. Even though nothing came of it and everyone involved was eventually found, I take this incident as a wake-up call. When the man put the gun to my head, I realized that all my bravado and self-assurance meant nothing. Taking such a chance was incredibly foolish because your life is in the hands of anyone who happens to be carrying a weapon at the time. Putting yourself in a dangerous situation with a stranger could be the last thing you do. So be careful if you work in a job where you regularly interact with strangers. Grocery delivery services boomed during COVID-19, and their popularity has only grown since then. For those orders, I was responsible for both picking and, in the case of staff shortages, delivering. It wasn't a terrible job. I liked making house calls. I wasn't complaining because I got to see nice houses and didn't have to answer customers' endless questions. The occasional tip was appreciated as well. However, I usually just left the groceries at the door, snapped a photo as proof, and then went about my day. But there were times when I got to know the locals and assisted them with their grocery loads. For example, there was this Serbian grandmother named Vesna who adored me. We became acquainted because of the weekly Thursday deliveries of essentially the same goods to her house. She never came out to meet me the first few times I brought her groceries, but I did catch her looking out the window. A brief wave, a photo, and I'd be back in the truck and on my way. She probably relaxed after she realized the same person was bringing her groceries each time. She welcomed me outside, and I began carrying her groceries inside and placing them on her counters. I didn't mind helping an elderly lady out, and she tipped me well. I got to know her better the more often I visited. She had recently lost her husband and was adjusting to life on her own. Her children were scattered across the country, and she saw them only during the holidays when she could travel by train. She, too, was now retired, but her luxurious home was the result of a successful career as a broker. Thursdays were always my favorite day of the week, and this one was no exception. Like clockwork, she placed her order on a Monday, and by Thursday, I was delivering her goods. Something wasn't right as soon as I pulled into the driveway. The door was open, but she wasn't there like she usually is. She usually leaves her blinds open so her plants can get some sun, so their closure caught my eye as odd. I approached the open entrance and, not seeing her, rang the bell. I waited a while, but nobody answered. Since there was still no response after several knocks, I began to feel concerned. Since she was elderly, my first thought was that she had fallen or suffered a heart attack. I just stood there, unsure of what to do. I debated going inside, but I was working, and I knew I was supposed to leave the groceries on the porch if no one answered. But as a good friend, I figured I should go in and at least put her groceries on the counter like I always do. Since the door was already open, I gathered the bags in both hands and headed for the kitchen. There was complete silence and the lights had been turned off. After setting the bags on her counter and calling her name once more, I got no answer. The thought of calling the police crossed my mind as I opened the door to leave, but I wasn't sure how to explain the seriousness of the situation if she had already left. Who knows, maybe she was just paying a visit and I wasted the cops' time. Despite my unusual circumstances, I sensed that something was off. As I reached the exit door, however, I heard a noise coming from upstairs. For a brief moment of relief, I called out for Vesna, but then there was once again silence as I stood there for what felt like an eternity. I became increasingly self-conscious as I heard what sounded like someone shuffling around upstairs. Back outside, I made my way to the car. After waiting for a while, the curtains on the second floor shifted to one side, as if someone were peering down at me through the window. I left the car, rounded the corner, and sat there in the street, bewildered. It could have been one of her children, or it could have been her, and she just didn't want to see anyone. Whether or not I should contact law enforcement was another source of anxiety for me. I left, did a complete circle, and returned to her neighborhood. Once again, I sat for a while until I noticed the upstairs curtains were open. A man appeared to peer out, but he quickly shut the window again, apparently alarmed by my truck. Since I knew Vesna had 2 daughters and a son who had died many years ago, I couldn't imagine who might be staying at her house in her absence. However, I had lingered too long and needed to get back to business. For the first time in nearly a year, she gave no directives the following week. On Thursday night, as I was driving home from work, I passed by her house and saw a police car parked in the driveway. My search for her name when I got home revealed that she had been reported missing only a few days after I had delivered her groceries. I went to her house and saw that man 2 days before the date they said she was likely last at home, but I noticed that the day after she ordered the groceries was the date they said she was likely last at home. With the evidence in hand, I contacted the authorities. It's been almost 3 years, and I still have no idea who that man was or if I was in danger of suffering the same fate. No new information about Vesna's disappearance surfaced as the weeks stretched into months. The police conducted an exhaustive investigation, including interviewing nearby residents and pursuing all possible leads, but ultimately came up empty. The investigation was never closed, but the likelihood that she was still alive diminished over time. When I went to her house that day, I couldn't help but feel bad about it. Things could have been different if I had called the police sooner or insisted on checking on her further. The past was gone, and all I could do was try to be more careful in the future. I kept on driving a grocery delivery route after the incident. It was still a practical job, and I liked assisting others. A nagging feeling of unease, however, followed me around every time I made a grocery delivery. I became more wary and alert, keeping an eye out for customers' odd or suspicious actions. The events of that day with Vesna continued to trouble me as time went on. Many times, I've pondered her whereabouts and well-being. I checked the headlines regularly for any new information, but there was none. It was as if she had disappeared completely. Almost 2 years after Vesna vanished, a detective assigned to her case finally contacted me via email. They requested a meeting with me to go over the events of that day. I had a strange blend of worry and optimism. Perhaps they knew something that would help solve the mystery. I told her everything that had happened that day, including the strange behavior and the man I had seen in her house. The detective appeared interested, making notes and asking clarifying questions. He reassured me that they were still looking into the incident and that any clues I provided could prove to be invaluable. It was comforting to know that the investigation into Vesna's disappearance was continuing after that meeting. However, months passed with no new information. I kept on delivering groceries, but my thoughts kept returning to that mystery. Vesna's case was never resolved, and time passed. The detective in charge of the case eventually got back in touch with me. They told me they had recently learned something that could be important to the case. Someone who fits the description of the man I saw at Vesna's house that day has come forward as a witness. The eyewitness claimed to have seen him acting suspiciously while prowling the area on multiple occasions. The police were following up on it because it was a promising lead. And with this new information, I had hoped that the Vesna case could be solved. I helped the police out by giving them any information they requested. But the investigation went on for a few more months. After nearly 3 years, police have arrested in the case. They have a suspect in custody for the disappearance of Vesna. As it turned out, the man I saw in her house had something to do with her disappearance. As word of the tragedy spread, it left a lasting impression on the local population. Though it was too late to save Vesna, her family was able to get some answers. Justice was done because the suspect was arrested and put on trial. When Vesna's case was finally resolved, I felt a wide range of emotions. Even though I was happy that they had found the culprit, I couldn't help but feel sad for Vesna and all the suffering she must have endured in the days leading up to her disappearance. I kept my job as a grocery delivery driver, but I became more vigilant and careful in my approach. Knowing the dangers of frequent contact with strangers, I took extra precautions to protect myself. I knew I would never forget Vesna or that fateful day. It was a sobering reminder that nothing is guaranteed in this life, and that even the most mundane activities can have profound consequences. I kept Vesna's memory alive in my heart as the years went by. I worried about her loved ones and hoped that finding out what happened to their mom and grandma would help. Ultimately, I emerged from the ordeal altered. It helped me become more aware of my surroundings and the possible threats that lie within everyday activities. Every delivery was special because I knew there was a different person's story behind the address. As a result, I kept doing grocery deliveries and doing my best to improve other people's lives in some way, just as Vesna had improved mine.